This is a presentation of OneLogin training.
Welcome to Managing OneLogin, Part 4. A huge benefit of implementing OneLogin is automating tasks such as assigning users to user security policy or assigning them to applications based upon, say, the department they belong to or maybe the office they work out of. OneLogin uses mappings to perform these automations. Our intent here is not to show you how to modify mappings because they are carefully designed and modifying them could cause unforeseen issues. What we want is for you to understand what mappings are used for and how you might need to be able to at least read through them to see what they are doing. Mappings are basically if-then statements that look at a user's attributes, and if the user's attributes match the conditions defined within the mapping, changes are made to the user account within OneLogin, such as assigning them to a OneLogin group, which in turn can assign them to a user security policy, or perhaps assigning them to a OneLogin role, which could assign them to one or more applications they need. Mappings fire off when a user is created or updated. This is important to understand because newly created mappings or mappings that have been changed are not applied to existing users automatically. There is a manual step known as reapply mappings that needs to be performed. We mentioned reapply mappings previously when we were talking about bulk operations, because it's one of the actions that is available through bulk operations. Here we can see an example of a mapping. In this example might read it as an if-then statement. I would say, if a user's email address contains onelogin-training.com, then set their role to the all employees role. So basically I'm saying any users whose SMTP domain is onelogin-training.com, that means they're probably an employee of this company, and assign them to a role called all employees. Now, if that role is associated with applications, because that's usually what roles are used for, is to assign applications to users, we would have to go to the role itself to figure out what applications are automatically being assigned with this particular mapping. All we know right now is anybody with that particular SMTP domain is part of the all employees role. So, as we stated, mappings only fire off when a user is created. New mappings and change mappings will only be applied to existing users when that reapply mapping action is taken. You can reapply mappings to all users from the main mappings page, which you'll find underneath the users menu. And what we're seeing here is where that reapply all mappings button is on the main mappings page. Other way that, of course, you might reapply mappings to users is, as we've already mentioned, through bulk operations. Okay, and here you might filter which users you want to reapply mappings to based upon a group they belong to, a role they are part of, and or their status. As we mentioned, all bulk operations can be filtered this way before. And lastly, you can do it through the More Actions menu for a particular user. So you can go to that user's account, choose More Actions, and you'll see Reapply Mappings there as an option. So let's take a look at how a mapping is created, how we might apply those mappings, and let's even check out how it might change a user account. All right, so again, might not have the ability to actually create or even see the mappings, but it is important to understand what they might be doing if, again, you're having some weird side effects for those users and you're trying to do a little troubleshooting. So we're going to go find those mappings again in the admin UI. Underneath the users menu, I can go see my mapping. So you can go look at a few of these. I've got this engineering one up here. It's looking at the department field of my users. This drop down here basically contains all user attributes, as well as some fun, time-based things, like days since their last login, days since their password changed, when was the user created. So their user attributes, some user time related event info there. So in this case, again, looking at its department field, got some equal, does not equal, contains, does not, contains, begins with, ends with type options here. And then basically a text box I can type into to choose or match up strings to whatever we're looking at. So I would read this as if department equals engineering, then in this case, perform an action. Assign them to the engineers group. Set group to engineers. So the actions drop down can set role or group, and that's mainly what we're talking about in this course, but can actually be used for a lot of other things. We can modify their status, change the directory, even modify the values in other user attribute fields. So that's something, again, a little trickier changes that people might be getting into, but definitely possible through these mappings. So this one though, just set group to engineers. And then I do have this fun feature here where I can type in somebody's name, click check, and see whether they match that criteria or not. In this case, Brian does not. So he would not be mapped. He would not be put into the engineers group because he's not part of the engineering department, or his department field does not equal engineering. Okay. So again, the mappings are created. They will fire off automatically anytime users are created or updated. So let's go check out a little of this, and let's actually take DDoS here, and DDoS is moving from the marketing department to the engineering department. It is this incredible lateral move on DDoS's part. So I am gonna go change DDoS's department field here, and I'm gonna click save. So what I should see then is DDoS should now be in the engineering group because DDoS now matches the criteria of that particular map. So let's go to the authentication tab, and lo and behold, group says engineers. Okay. And the group policy associated, by the way, with the engineers group is the UB policy, and therefore now the security policy that is applying to my buddy DDoS here is the UB policy, meaning that he's going to be forced to use a UB key, part of his multi-factor authentication there. Now, again, depending upon your permissions, you're not creating these mappings or such. But, well, what if somebody, so he really shouldn't be in the engineers group. He should be in the sales group. So you simply go in and change DDoS's group there from from engineering to sales. Seems simple enough. Well, if I go back to the authentication tab, notice what's happened here. DDoS is back in the engineers group because the minute I made that change, the mapping fired off, and the mapping just changed it back to what the mapping wanted it to be. So if there is a mapping there, you can't really override whatever the mapping's done. And that's important to understand. So sometimes when things are acting a little illogically, right, then we might get a little concerned, and maybe there's a mapping going on. There's something automatic happening in the background. Mappings, good place to start. Also, what about if when we added DDoS to the engineering department, somebody typed that in, kind of fat-fingered engineering there. Okay. Well, DDoS was in the engineers group, but now let's try to change him out of the engineers group. Does the mapping still apply to him? Well, the answer is no. Right? I was successfully able to move him out of the engineers group because no longer matches that criteria. So you can see, understanding what mappings are there, what they're designed to do can be really important if you're trying to solve some behaviors that don't quite seem logical to you. Like, I just changed that. Why isn't it staying? Or why isn't he assigned to the group that he's supposed to be? Okay. Mappings might be the answer. So we talked quite a bit about using mappings to assign users to OneLogin group or OneLogin roles. Well, let's make sure we really understand what a OneLogin group is versus a OneLogin role. Simply stated, users that are assigned to a OneLogin role are in turn assigned to any applications associated with that role. So users assigned to one or more applications via a role. And users can belong to multiple roles. There might be a role that is for, say, a department they belong into, and thus any applications that everybody in that department needs are assigned to them based upon the fact that they're in that role, and that role is associated with those applications. Or there might be a specific role that is used to assign a particular application. Like I might have a Salesforce role, and it's only associated with our Salesforce app connector. Thus, anybody assigned to the Salesforce role is assigned to that Salesforce application. Again, users can belong to multiple roles. Groups are used to assign users to a security policy, those user security policies. We've seen a few examples of them earlier in this course. User security policies can define how a user is able to self-service reset their password. User security policies could control what authentication factors a user is required to use. Basically, user security policies control how a user logs into the OneLogin platform. Thus, users can only have one user security policy assigned to them at any given time. Groups are used to assign users to user security policies. A group is associated with the policy. I put the user into the group. The users are now associated with that policy. Since users can only be assigned to one security policy at a time, they can only be assigned to one group. This is important to understand because in other applications, users usually can belong to multiple groups, but groups are used for different things in those other applications. OneLogin groups are very specifically used to assign users to user security policies, or a user security policy, and that's only one. So, whereas users can belong to more than one role, and roles are used to assign users to applications, users can only belong to one group, and that group is used to assign them to a user security policy. Users can manually be assigned to one or more roles, and they could manually be assigned to a group. However, it's kind of more fun to be able to automatically assign them to a group and or those roles. And that's, of course, where those mappings come into place. So, how do you know if a user was manually assigned to a role? Well, you can go to the user record, click on their applications tab, and any of the roles listed there that have a green check mark by them means that they were manually assigned to that role. How do you know if a user is manually assigned to a group? That's a little harder to tell, actually. There's no visual indicator. The only way you'd really know is if you went to, again, that user record. You go to the authentication tab for the user record and maybe choose a different group. How do you know that they were manually assigned the previous group? Well, once you save, if you go back in and if they're reverted back to that original group, that means they were automatically assigned to that original group because that's the mapping kicking in. Okay. If they were manually assigned to the group, you would have the ability to manually change the group that they're assigned to. That's really the only way you can tell. So again, only way that you can tell if a user was manually assigned to a group by simply looking at the user record is to try to change the group that they are assigned to. And when you click save, that change persists. If that change is rolled back, that means they were assigned to the group via mapping, because that mapping clicked in the minute you save the change. Because when do mappings fire off? When user records are changed. And simply by you trying to change their group, that's a change. Mapping fires off. Mapping will determine what group they're in. So that's an automatic assignment. How do you know which apps a user was actually assigned to via a role? Well, go to that application tab, and if you hover over one of the roles that they were assigned to, now again, the ones they are manually assigned to will be the ones with the green check marks. The ones that they were assigned to via mapping, by the way, are the ones that are grayed out there with the double arrows. Those other ones that really don't have anything next to them, those are just roles that exist that this particular user has not been assigned to in one way or another yet. But how do you know which apps they were actually assigned to via the role? You can hover over the role there, and there's a little pop-up that'll show you the apps associated with it. You can also run reports. We'll take a look at reports later on in the course, but there are reports that you can run, like which users are assigned to which applications kind of thing. Now, how do I know then if a user was manually assigned to a user policy? That one actually has that little red piece that pops in there where it says this will override any other policies. Otherwise, it says underneath user security policy that basically it's the policy associated with the group that they were assigned to. So let's recap that again. So users assigned to a group. The group is associated to a security policy. Thus, the user assigned to the group gets that policy assigned to them. I can manually assign users to a group, but I can't change, and I can change that group if I want to. But if a user is automatically assigned to the group via a mapping, I can't change the group for them manually, right? We talked about that. It'll roll it back because the mapping will keep firing off, assigning them to the original group. Thus, I can't change their policy manually, again, if mapping's applied to them, by manually changing the group. However, if I do need to manually change the policy applied to a user, I can choose a new policy for them underneath that user security policy menu. I know that that has happened because I will see the lovely red message that says this will override any other policies. All right, next section here we're going to look at is how to troubleshoot mapping issues. So common issues that might be solved while looking at mappings. Like, why doesn't my user have the right security policy applied to them? Maybe it's been overridden. Maybe they don't match the mapping criteria. Okay, those are some things to look at. So first, go look at that authentication tab and see what group that user is associated with. What policy has been assigned to that user? Is it the policy associated with the group, or did somebody override that setting? Also, other possibility or problem you might run into is why isn't my user assigned to a particular application? Again, if I expect them to be assigned to that application automatically, maybe I should go look at that mapping. What criteria is it looking at? Does that user have attributes that match that criteria? Sometimes, if we are depending upon human beings to enter in that information about the users, people misspell things, right? Or they forget to enter in values in particular fields. So, what happened? Again, look at user information, maybe check out the mapping that should have assigned them to the role, thus should have assigned them to the application. What's wrong with the data? Assuming, of course, the mapping is working for other users, right? If it's not working for anybody, then something's wrong with the mapping logic. But if it seems kind of off for a particular user, then maybe the data itself is wrong. Now, another type of automation that OneLogin can manage is the creation of user accounts within the applications themselves, and even assigning users to, say, particular security roles or groups within the applications based upon their attributes within OneLogin. So this is handled with a feature that's called provisioning. And provisioning has kind of its own form of mappings called rules. So first, let's make sure you understand what provisioning is. User provisioning is basically the act of creating, updating, even deleting users in an application through OneLogin. OneLogin basically does a GET call to the application to see if the user exists. If they don't exist, then we're going to go and post and create the user. The user gets updated within OneLogin. That's going to go trigger an update within the application. So we'll update those attributes over an application. And then if the user leaves OneLogin or no longer needs access to the application, we can actually decide what to do then. We could delete them within the application, maybe disable them, suspend them, or maybe do nothing. And then rules, as we mentioned, are like mappings. They're basic if-then statements. So rules can look at those user attributes within OneLogin and match to particular values that you might want to, say, assign to them within the application itself. So we can see what values are being sent across by default for each one of our users that's being created through this provisioning process by looking at the parameters tab on a particular application. So what we're seeing here is an app connector to G Suite. And so the optional parameters on this page basically represent all these possible fields that we could send over when we're creating a new account in G Suite through provisioning. So if we want, say, the department field in G Suite for a user to match the department field over in OneLogin, then we would enable the department field through these parameters and match it up to the department field in OneLogin, as we can see here. Now, rules come into play when you want different sets of users to be assigned to different default values. So they're very similar to mappings, but they're actually defined at the application level. So again, the conditions are looking at those user fields within OneLogin, same as mappings. It's really the actions where the difference is. The actions for rules are specific to, kind of general terms, what we call entitlements. So for the most part, they're fields that control what a user can do within that application. So like in Salesforce, it'd be the profile or the Salesforce role that they're assigned to. In some cases, it might actually be just other fields over in the application itself. And here, we can see an example of a rule. How would I read this rule? Well, this rule says that if a user's title contains sales development rep, and that all there means I say and in between those conditions. If it said any, I'd say or, but all right. So if user's title contains sales development rep and they are in the NA sales role within OneLogin, then go perform these actions. In this case, this is for Salesforce. So set their profile field in Salesforce to the sales profile and set their role to the Eastern Sales Team. So those are the values that we would send across for those users that match these conditions. So again, kind of a way of overriding those default parameters. Well, and then let's take a look at how we might create some of those rules. All right, so we looked at mappings in our last demo. Let's go take a look at those rules. Again, probably don't have the permissions to create the rules, but they're making things happen automagically, so they can cause some weird stuff to happen sometimes if you don't know that they're there or that they're firing off. So it's important to know where to look to find them and see what's going on. So we're over and again in the admin UI, and then rules are defined on a per app basis. So I need to go into the app connectors themselves. In this case, I'm going to go look at one of my Salesforce connectors that I've configured, and I am going to click on the rules tab, and I can actually see got a few rules in here. So just FYI, at one point rules were called entitlement mappings, so it's kind of fun. If I go look at a rule here, it still says mapping up at the top. Yeah, slightly confusing, but that's what it is. Anyway, so this is a rule. How do I know it's a rule? Well, I'm looking at something that was created in the application itself, the app connector level, so it's a rule. The mappings are what we find if we go to the users menu and look at mappings. Mappings affect user data, basically modify user attributes within OneLogin itself. Rules affect user data or attributes within the application they are defined for. So they have both the same structure. They're if-then statements. Both mappings and rules are if-then statements. It's just a matter of their actions. Again, the actions are different for them, and they're defined at a different level. So here, my rule says if the state or region field for my user contains the word East, and, because it says all up here, read the all as an and, any kind of reads as an or operator there, but, and department equals sales. So they live in the East and their department is sales. Then set their role in Salesforce to the Eastern Sales Team. So again, this is setting basically kind of their permissions within Salesforce are now going to be based upon whatever this role permissions are within Salesforce. Okay. So the structure looks almost exactly like those mappings that we looked at. Difference, again, is these actions. The actions are relating to, in this case, attributes over in Salesforce. That's what I can modify with these rules because it is a rule defined within the Salesforce app connector. So we took a look at rules again to just kind of understand where we might see them, understand a little bit of the reasoning behind them. But we're not focusing again, so much on how to configure provisioning or how to create those rules. What we want to make sure is that you understand the provisioning process and you understand what rules are used for when you are trying to do a little bit of troubleshooting. So, some of the common issues that you might have when provisioning is configured. And one of them might be the fact that some of those attributes like permissions in the applications themselves are actually being overridden. Like there's actually, in this case, say a Salesforce operations person who manages things like profile and Salesforce roles over within Salesforce. And they're trying to assign people to particular roles, and for some reason that keeps changing on them. Well, it might be changing because the provisioning in OneLogin is set up to send those values across when a user is created and are updated in OneLogin, and thus it's overriding the settings within Salesforce. So y'all need to decide what's going to be basically the source of truth. Is OneLogin the source of truth for those settings, or do you want the Salesforce ops person to manage this stuff. If you want the Salesforce ops person to manage it, then you need to stop sending the values across. So there on Salesforce, in fact, there's a general tick box that says don't update entitlements kind of thing. You could do that, or you simply make sure that those fields aren't being sent across. Thus, this checkbox in the bottom left there that you see says include in user provisioning. Don't send it across. Clear the checkbox. Okay, that should prevent it from overriding settings over in the application itself. Another issue would be that the user is not being created, updated, or deleted within the application as expected. You think that provisioning is running, but you're not seeing those changes. You're not even seeing the user over there, perhaps. So a couple things could be off with that. Like number one, make sure provisioning actually is enabled. Okay. But if it is working for other users and maybe like this user for some reason you don't see, it could be that provisioning failed for some reason. So you can actually check the status of the provisioning process, either from the Users tab on the application, as we see on the left-hand side for Salesforce there, or if you go to the Users menu and choose Provisioning, there is a view of all the provisioning tasks across all applications there. So you can see what was successful, what's waiting for approval, etc. through there. So maybe there is some sort of error, or more commonly, it's actually just waiting for approval. So those ones that say pending, both on the left-hand side and on the right-hand side, are waiting for an administrative type to come along and approve whatever the action is, whether it's a create, update, or delete of that user. By default, all app connectors that are enabled for provisioning require approval for those tasks to actually be completed. It is a change that needs to be made on the app connector itself to no longer require approval. So if you don't want to have to approve every single update, then make sure that the app connector is modified so that it doesn't require approval. And here is where we can actually see require admin approval before this action is performed. All those checkboxes by default are checked. If I don't want to have to approve every update, but I do want to approve creates and deletes, then say the update user checkbox there would need to be cleared. This is also where you can kind of fine tune what will happen if a user is deleted in OneLogin, or maybe they're disabled or the app is removed from them. And those are the two bottom options there. First one, when users are deleted in OneLogin or they're removed from the app. So like removed from the role that assigned them to the app, or if the app was manually assigned to them, removed from the app that way. Then perform the below action. And usually the options are suspend, delete, or do nothing. And then you can also choose when a user is suspended in OneLogin, what do you want to have happen? And again, suspend, do nothing. Those are the most common options for that drop-down. So each application you need to think about. How does the onboarding process need to look like? So like, how do we want that user created? What values do we want to send over for that user? Like those parameters and the rules. And then the user leaves the organization. How do we want to deprovision them or offboard them? Some applications, you might simply want to delete their account. Other applications, you might want to simply disable or suspend them. And then, reassign their objects to somebody else. Or maybe just leave them alone. Again, per application basis, you need to make these decisions, and thus on a per application basis on this provisioning tab, you can configure what will happen, both during onboarding as well as offboarding. And again, part of provisioning, part of those parameters, that we can send across can control the level of access that the user has within the application. So if we think that the user should have automatically been created, then we need to look at things like, is the attribute sent over in order to assign them to the application or to that role, or in this case, say the profile that controls what they can do within the application? Do we have any sort of rules that that user might or might not match that are behaving not quite as we expected? Do we actually have an updated list of some of those values that we can assign to them from the application? This is this little refresh entitlement step. You see this is a little refresh link down there towards the bottom. That actually pulls in available values that we can assign to them within the application. Maybe that's out of date. And in general, is provisioning enabled and working? That's that checkbox at the top. So as with any kind of troubleshooting process, where you start looking depends upon the scope. Is this relative to a single user or is this across several users? If it's relative to a single user, then check out, again, maybe some of the rules that apply to them. Maybe they're pending your approval kind of thing in order just to be created over there. If it is for several users or most of the users, then check the overall configuration, right? Is it enabled? Do I have up-to-date values? So whoever configured that application or the team that's in charge of that application, they need to double check their settings and their process. All right. Last section here, we're going to look at our event viewer, our jobs, and reporting system, all of which can be very, very helpful when it comes to troubleshooting. This concludes part 4 of managing OneLogin. Now please continue on to part 5 so you can see how to view events, monitor jobs, and utilize our built-in reporting service.
This is a presentation of OneLogin training.